The rain came down in sheets, relentless and unforgiving, as if the sky itself was conspiring against him. Jake Harper gripped the steering wheel of his battered pickup truck with white-knuckled intensity, squinting through the blur of windshield wipers that struggled to keep up. The narrow country road twisted like a serpent through the dense woods, its edges swallowed by shadows. His headlights barely pierced the darkness, illuminating only fleeting glimpses of gnarled trees and slick asphalt. He cursed under his breath, the storm making every mile feel like an eternity. Jake had been on his way home from another grueling day at the farm, hands calloused, back aching, and pockets emptier than ever. Life hadn't been kind to him lately. The crops were failing, the bank was breathing down his neck, and the weight of it all pressed heavily on his chest. But tonight, fate seemed determined to test him further. As he rounded a sharp bend, his heart leapt into his throat. Through the chaos of rain and wind, he saw it. A car teetering precariously on the edge of the ravine, its rear wheels already hanging over the abyss. Time slowed to a crawl. Without hesitation, Jake slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just feet away. His boots hit the mud before the truck even fully halted, splashing water as he sprinted toward the wreckage. The vehicle's headlights flickered weakly, casting eerie reflections off the rain-soaked ground. Inside, he could see movement. A woman slumped over the steering wheel, her face obscured by tangled hair and shattered glass. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to focus. "Hey, can you hear me?" he shouted, yanking at the mangled door. It groaned in protest, refusing to budge. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he scanned the scene. There wasn't much time. One wrong move, and the car would plummet into the ravine below. Jake grabbed a crowbar from his truck bed, the cold metal biting into his palm as he wedged it into the gap. Muscles burned, but he didn't stop. Not when the car shifted ominously, not when the rain soaked him to the bone. Finally, with a deafening screech, the door gave way. He reached inside, his hands trembling as he unbuckled the woman and hauled her out just as the car tipped forward, disappearing into the void with a sickening crunch. She collapsed into his arms, unconscious but alive. Jake sank to his knees, cradling her protectively as thunder roared overhead. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if waking from a trance, he pulled out his phone, praying for a signal amidst the storm. This night had changed everything, and he had no idea just how much. As the storm began to subside, Jake found himself sitting beside the mysterious woman he had rescued, now safely ensconced in the warmth of his modest farmhouse. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing a striking shade of green that seemed to pierce through the dim light of the room. She was disoriented, her gaze darting around as if trying to piece together fragments of a dream. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice tinged with both confusion and relief. "I'm Jake," he introduced himself, his tone gentle yet firm. "You're safe now. You were in an accident." Her eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, there was an unspoken connection, a silent acknowledgement of the life-altering event they had shared. The woman, who introduced herself as Evelyn, was unlike anyone Jake had ever met. Her demeanor was poised, her speech articulate, yet there was a vulnerability about her that intrigued him. As she regained her composure, snippets of conversation revealed her to be a person of significant means and influence. Yet, she spoke of her wealth and status with a humility that belied her true identity. Jake listened intently, captivated by her stories of global travels and high-stakes business dealings, each word painting a picture of a life vastly different from his own. Despite their starkly contrasting backgrounds, a bond began to form between them. Evelyn's gratitude towards Jake was palpable, her eyes often softening as she regarded him with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. In turn, Jake found himself drawn to her resilience and grace under pressure. Their conversations, though sporadic due to Evelyn's need for rest, were filled with laughter and moments of profound insight, bridging the gap between the humble farmer and the enigmatic billionaire. As days turned into weeks, Jake noticed subtle changes in himself. The constant worry about his financial struggles seemed to ease, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Evelyn's presence in his life acted as a catalyst, pushing him to view his circumstances through a new lens. Her belief in his potential ignited a spark within him, fueling a desire to transcend the limitations he had long accepted as immutable truths. In those quiet moments shared between them, amidst the backdrop of Jake's rustic home, a transformation was quietly unfolding. Evelyn, unknowingly, was not just a visitor in Jake's life, but a harbinger of change, setting the stage for revelations that would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. It was a crisp morning when the sleek black sedan rolled up Jake's gravel driveway, its tires crunching audibly against the uneven surface. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the weathered barn and fields beyond. Jake had just finished feeding the chickens, his mind still lingering on the strange yet comforting presence Evelyn had brought into his life. He wiped his hands on his jeans and squinted at the unfamiliar vehicle, its polished exterior gleaming incongruously against the rustic backdrop of his farm. Something about it felt off, like a predator encroaching on sacred ground. The driver's door opened first, revealing a sharply dressed man in a charcoal suit, his movements precise and deliberate. Behind him emerged another figure, a tall, imposing man whose mere presence seemed to command the air around him. Jake froze, his pulse quickening as the stranger stepped forward. There was something unnervingly familiar about the man's chiseled jawline and piercing gray eyes, yet Jake couldn't place where he'd seen him before. His stomach churned with unease as the man approached, flanked by two more suited figures who moved with military precision. "Mr. Harper," the man said, his deep voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered with an authority that left no room for doubt. Jake nodded hesitantly, his hand instinctively tightening around the pitchfork he still held. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the knot of dread forming in his chest. The man stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "My name is Victor Langston," he replied, his words clipped and measured. "I believe you've recently had the pleasure of meeting someone very close to me." His gaze bore into Jake's searching, assessing. Jake's mind raced. Close to him? Evelyn. Of course. But why did this man make his skin crawl? Before Jake could respond, Victor gestured subtly to one of his men, who produced a tablet and held it out for Jake to see. On the screen was a photo of Evelyn, smiling confidently at some high-profile event. Beneath it was a headline, "Billionaire heiress missing after mysterious accident." Jake's breath hitched. Billionaire heiress? The pieces clicked into place with a sickening clarity. Evelyn hadn't just been wealthy. She was part of one of the most powerful families in the world. And this man standing before him wasn't just any businessman. He was her father. Victor's next words confirmed it. "Evelyn is my daughter," he said, his tone colder than the frost clinging to the grass. "And I'm here to take her home." The weight of those words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. Home. Not this ramshackle farmhouse. Not the life he'd begun to imagine might somehow include her. No, Evelyn belonged to a world far removed from his own. A gilded cage guarded by men like Victor, who radiated power and control with every step. Jake's grip on the pitchfork tightened further, his knuckles whitening. "She's safe here," he said, his voice rising slightly. "She's recovering. You can't just show up and—" "I can do whatever I damn well please," Victor interrupted, his voice laced with venom. "You think you understand what's best for her? You think your little act of heroism gives you some claim over her? Let me make one thing perfectly clear, boy. You're nothing. A speck of dust beneath our shoes." His words were a whip, each syllable designed to cut deeper than the last. Jake felt his anger flare, but before he could retort, Victor took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over Jake. "Do you know what happens to people who get in my way?" he asked, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "They disappear. Completely. Utterly. Gone." His eyes glinted with a predatory gleam, and for the first time, Jake truly understood the stakes. This wasn't just about Evelyn anymore. This was about survival. Victor straightened, his expression shifting to one of smug satisfaction. "Now, where is she?" Jake's mind raced. He glanced toward the house, where Evelyn lay sleeping upstairs, unaware of the storm brewing outside. Betrayal clawed at his insides. How could he protect her when the odds were so stacked against him? But as he looked back at Victor, something inside him hardened. He wouldn't let fear dictate his actions. Not this time. Not when it mattered most. "She's not going anywhere with you," Jake said, his voice unwavering despite the tremor in his legs. Victor's lips curled into a cruel smile, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, Victor raised his hand, signaling his men to advance. Jake braced himself, knowing full well that this confrontation was only beginning, and that the cost of defiance would be steep. The tension in the air was palpable as Victor's men closed in, their polished shoes crunching against the gravel with mechanical precision. Jake stood his ground, gripping the pitchfork like a lifeline, his heart pounding in his ears. Every fiber of his being screamed to fight, to protect Evelyn at all costs. But the sheer force of Victor's presence loomed over him like an immovable wall. "You really think you can stop us, boy?" Victor sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "This isn't some fairy tale where the farmhand gets the princess. She belongs to me, to us, and you're just a pawn in a game you don't even understand." Jake's jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he tightened his grip. "She's not property," he shot back, his voice shaking but defiant. "She's a person, and if you cared about her at all, you wouldn't treat her like she's yours to control." Victor's laugh was cold, hollow, reverberating through the stillness of the morning. "Control? Oh, you naive fool. Control is what keeps her alive. Do you have any idea what's waiting for her out there? The enemies, the vultures circling? She's safer with me than she'll ever be with you." He took another step forward, his towering frame casting an even longer shadow over Jake. "But let's be honest. You're not doing this for her, are you? You're doing it because you think you deserve her. Because you think saving her makes you special." The accusation struck a nerve, igniting a firestorm of doubt within Jake. Was Victor right? Had he convinced himself that rescuing Evelyn somehow elevated him, made him worthy of her world? The thought gnawed at him, twisting his resolve into something darker, sharper. "Maybe I don't deserve her," Jake admitted, his voice low but fierce. "But neither do you. She deserves better than either of us." Victor's expression darkened, his patience wearing thin. "Enough of this nonsense," he snapped, turning to his men. "Bring her out. Now." The order sent a jolt of panic through Jake. He couldn't let them take her. Not like this. Not when she was still vulnerable, still healing. But how could he possibly stand against them? They were trained, armed, untouchable. And he was just a broke farm boy with nothing but a pitchfork and a desperate hope. As the men moved toward the house, Jake's mind raced. He thought of Evelyn's laughter, the way her eyes softened when she talked about her dreams, the quiet moments they'd shared that felt almost sacred. He couldn't lose her. Not to this man, not to a life she clearly didn't want. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he felt the weight of his insignificance pressing down on him. He was nothing compared to Victor Langston, a man who could crush him with a single word. But then, something inside him snapped. "No!" Jake shouted, stepping between them and the house. His voice cracked with raw emotion, startling even himself. "You want her? You'll have to go through me first." The words hung in the air, heavy and defiant, and for a split second, Victor's icy composure faltered. There was something in Jake's eyes, something wild, untamed, and utterly unafraid, that made the billionaire hesitate. Victor's lip curled into a snarl. "Fine," he growled, "if that's how you want to play it." With a curt nod, he signaled his men to restrain Jake. Two of them lunged forward, grabbing his arms and forcing the pitchfork from his grasp. Jake struggled, kicking and thrashing, but their grip was ironclad. He was dragged backward, his boots scraping against the gravel as he fought with every ounce of strength he had. "Evelyn!" he yelled, his voice breaking. "Run!" The front door creaked open, and Evelyn appeared, her face pale but resolute. She took in the scene, the men holding Jake, Victor's commanding stance, and her eyes widened in horror. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" Victor turned to her, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Evelyn, darling, we're going home. It's time." His tone was calm, almost soothing, but there was an underlying steel that brooked no argument. "No," Evelyn said, her voice firmer now. "I'm not leaving. Not like this." She stepped forward, her gaze locking onto Jake's. There was a fire in her eyes, a determination that mirrored his own. He saved my life. He protected me when no one else could. If you care about me at all, you'll leave him alone. Victor's face darkened, his patience finally snapping. You don't know what you're saying, he spat. This nobody has no place in your life. He's a distraction, a liability. You belong with your family, with people who can give you everything you need. And what exactly do I need, Dad? Evelyn shot back, her voice rising. A life where I'm told what to do, who to be. Is that what you think I want? Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. Jake showed me kindness, compassion, things I haven't felt in years, things you've never given me. The words hit Victor like a physical blow. For the first time, his mask of invincibility slipped, revealing the cracks beneath. He stared at his daughter, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a response. But before he could speak, Jake's voice cut through the silence. You don't get to decide her future, he said, his tone steady despite the pain in his arms. She's not a possession. She's a person. And if you truly loved her, you'd respect her choices, even if they don't include you. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, the standoff reaching a fever pitch. Victor's fists clenched at his sides, his pride warring with the undeniable truth in Jake's words. For a moment, it seemed as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which side would break first. The standoff crackled with tension, each second stretching into an eternity as Victor's fury simmered just beneath the surface. His eyes darted between Evelyn and Jake, the betrayal etched deeply into his features. Respect her choices, he echoed, his voice rising with incredulity. You think you're capable of understanding what's best for her? You're a child playing at being a savior, and you'll destroy everything she's worked for. His words were a lash, meant to wound, but Jake stood firm, his resolve hardening with every insult hurled his way. Jake's voice, when it came, was calm but edged with steel. I may not have your money or your power, but I know one thing you've forgotten. Love isn't about control. It's about freedom, about letting someone choose their own path, even if it's not the one you'd pick for them. The conviction in his tone caught Evelyn's attention, her eyes widening as she watched the young farmer confront her father with a courage she hadn't known he possessed. Victor scoffed, stepping closer to Jake, his towering frame attempting to intimidate. Freedom? Is that what you call it? Letting her throw away her legacy, her responsibilities, for this? He gestured wildly at the modest farmhouse behind them, his disgust palpable. You think this is what she wants? A life of poverty, of struggle? You're delusional. Jake's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Evelyn stepped forward, her voice cutting through the storm like a beacon. Stop it, she cried, her voice trembling with emotion. Stop acting like you know what I want, what I need. You've spent my entire life dictating my choices, molding me into someone I'm not. But I'm done. I'm done living for your approval, for your expectations. Her words hung in the air, heavy with years of pent-up frustration and longing. Victor's face contorted with disbelief, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You ungrateful, he began, but Evelyn cut him off, her voice rising with a ferocity that startled even herself. No, Dad. You listen to me. Jake didn't save me just to keep me here. He saved me because he saw me as a person, not as your property. He treated me with kindness, with respect, things I haven't felt from you in years. And if you can't accept that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't deserve me. The words hit Victor like a physical blow, his composure shattering. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for a rebuttal. But none came. Instead, his shoulders sagged, the weight of Evelyn's rejection bearing down on him. The men flanking him shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to proceed in the face of such raw emotion. Jake seized the moment, his voice ringing out with newfound authority. You can't buy love, Mr. Langston. You can't force it or control it. And you sure as hell can't take it away. Evelyn deserves to live her life on her own terms. And if you truly care about her, you'll let her. Victor's eyes narrowed, his pride warring with the undeniable truth in Jake's words. For a fleeting moment, It seemed as though he might lash out, might order his men to drag Evelyn away by force. But then something shifted. His gaze softened ever so slightly as he looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the woman she had become, not the puppet he had tried to mold. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Have it your way. But don't come crying to me when this fantasy falls apart." With that, he turned on his heel, motioning for his men to follow. The sleek sedan roared to life, its tires spitting gravel as it sped down the driveway, leaving behind a cloud of dust and unanswered questions. For a moment, the three of them stood in silence, the enormity of what had just transpired sinking in. Evelyn turned to Jake, her eyes shining with gratitude and something deeper, something unspoken. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For everything." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of triumph and uncertainty. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. And as he looked into Evelyn's eyes, he realized that the hardest choices were still ahead. The aftermath of Victor's departure lingered like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary of simplicity and solace, now felt charged with an electric tension. Jake sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The confrontation with Victor replayed in his mind like a broken record, each word slicing deeper with every loop. He had stood his ground, defied a man who could crush him with a snap of his fingers, and somehow emerged victorious, or so it seemed. But victory, Jake quickly realized, came with its own burdens. Evelyn paced the room, her movements restless, her thoughts visibly racing. She stopped abruptly, her gaze fixing on Jake. "Do you realize what you've done?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "You stood up to him. To him. No one's ever done that for me." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but there was a fire in them too, a spark of liberation ignited by Jake's defiance. Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand through his damp hair. "I didn't do it for you," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. Because no one should have to live under someone else's thumb, least of all you." His words carried a weight he hadn't intended, a confession of sorts. He had fought not just for Evelyn, but for the ideals he believed in: freedom, choice, humanity. Yet, as the adrenaline faded and reality set in, doubt crept in like a thief in the night. "What happens now?" he asked, more to himself than to her. "Your dad's not just going to walk away. He'll find a way to make us pay for this." The thought gnawed at him, a gnawing fear that perhaps he had bitten off more than he could chew. Victor Langston wasn't a man who accepted defeat gracefully. He was a predator, and predators always circled back. Evelyn sank into the chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But I can't go back to that life. Not after this. Not after seeing what it feels like to be free." Her words were a plea, a declaration, and a promise all at once. She looked at Jake, her eyes searching his face for reassurance, for answers he wasn't sure he had. Jake leaned forward, his elbows resting on the scarred wooden table. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said, his tone resolute despite the storm raging inside him. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it head on. But you need to know something. I'm not a knight in shining armor. I'm just a guy trying to do the right thing. And sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't mean things will work out the way you hope." Evelyn nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I don't expect you to fix everything," she said. I need to know that I'm not alone in this. That I have someone who sees me for who I am, not for what I represent." Her vulnerability struck a chord deep within Jake, unraveling the layers of guilt and self-doubt that had been festering since the confrontation. He reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. "You're not alone," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "Not anymore." But as the hours passed and the initial adrenaline wore off, the gravity of their situation settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Jake wandered outside, the cool evening air doing little to ease the turmoil in his chest. The farm stretched out before him, its fields bathed in the golden glow of twilight. It was beautiful, serene, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing within him. He thought about Evelyn, about the life she had left behind, and the uncertain future ahead. Could he truly protect her? Could he shield her from the wrath of a man like Victor Langston? The doubts clawed at him, relentless and unyielding. What if he failed her? What if his defiance only made things worse? He had acted on instinct, driven by a moral compass that refused to waver, but now he wondered if he had been reckless. Evelyn deserved better than a broke farm boy with nothing to offer but empty promises. Yet, as he stood there, staring out at the horizon, he realized something crucial. He couldn't undo what had been done. All he could do was move forward, one step at a time, and hope that his choices would lead them to a brighter tomorrow. When Evelyn joined him outside, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, he turned to her with a weary smile. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice steadier now. "One way or another." She returned his smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Together," she agreed, her voice firm despite the uncertainty that lingered between them. Together, they faced the unknown, their hearts heavy with the weight of freedom, but buoyed by the fragile hope that they might carve out a life worth fighting for. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and whispered plans. Jake and Evelyn transformed the old barn into a makeshift command center, its weathered walls adorned with maps, notes, and photographs of Victor's sprawling empire. Each image was a thread in the web they sought to unravel, a puzzle piece in the larger scheme they hoped to dismantle. Evelyn, drawing on her insider knowledge, revealed the inner workings of her father's business, a labyrinth of corruption, exploitation, and greed. It was a world Jake had only glimpsed in headlines, but now it loomed large, its shadows stretching into every corner of their lives. Their plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. Using Evelyn's connections and Jake's resourcefulness, they began gathering evidence of Victor's illegal activities, bribery schemes, offshore accounts, and unethical land acquisitions that had displaced countless families. It was dangerous work, fraught with risks that kept Jake awake at night. Every email intercepted, every document smuggled out, felt like a step closer to justice, and a step closer to disaster. Yet, there was no turning back. The stakes were too high, the cost of failure too great. One evening, as they pored over a stack of incriminating files, Evelyn paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph. "Do you think this will be enough?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "Enough to bring him down?" Jake looked up from the map he'd been studying, his expression grim but resolute. "It has to be," he replied. "We've come too far to stop now. Besides, your dad's not invincible. He's just good at making people believe he is." Evelyn nodded, though her eyes betrayed her unease. "And when it's over, what happens to us?" Jake hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He had spent so much time focused on taking Victor down that he hadn't allowed himself to consider what came next. Would Evelyn return to her old life, forever marked by the scars of their rebellion? Would he retreat to the solitude of his farm, haunted by the ghosts of battles fought and won? Or was there a third path, one they couldn't yet see? "We'll cross that bridge when we get there," he said finally, his voice softer. "Right now, we focus on making sure he can't hurt anyone else." The final confrontation came sooner than expected. Victor, sensing the threat posed by his daughter's defection, launched a calculated strike. Armed guards descended upon the farm in the dead of night, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like blades. Jake and Evelyn barely escaped, fleeing into the woods with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a USB drive containing the evidence they had gathered. The chase that followed was harrowing, a desperate race against time as they evaded capture and pieced together their next move. It was Evelyn who suggested turning the tables. "He thinks he's untouchable," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. "Let's prove him wrong. Let's expose him. To the world, to everyone he's ever hurt." The plan was risky, but it was their only shot. Under the cover of dawn, they uploaded the damning evidence to an anonymous whistleblower platform, ensuring it reached the hands of investigative journalists and law enforcement agencies. Within hours, the story exploded, headlines screaming of Victor Langston's fall from grace. The media frenzy was relentless, the public outcry deafening. For For the first time in decades, the billionaire titan was rendered powerless, his empire crumbling beneath the weight of his own crimes. When the authorities finally arrived at the farmhouse, Jake and Evelyn stood side by side, their faces pale but resolute. Victor was led away in handcuffs, his once imposing figure reduced to a shell of its former self. As the cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, Jake felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching the scene unfold from afar. Justice had been served, but it came at a cost, one he wasn't sure he was ready to bear. In the days that followed, the world seemed to move on, the scandal fading into the background noise of endless news cycles. But for Jake and Evelyn, the aftermath was anything but ordinary. They retreated to the farmhouse, seeking solace in its familiar creaks and groans. Yet, the silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken fears and lingering doubts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn broke the quiet. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything we did." Jake turned to her, his heart aching with the weight of her question. "No," he said after a long pause. "I don't regret standing up to him. I don't regret fighting for what's right. But," he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the fields beyond, "I guess I regret thinking it would fix everything, that it would make things easier." Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Me too," she admitted. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to have all the answers. Maybe it's just about trying to do better, even when it's hard." Jake reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "Then we'll keep trying," he said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty that still lingered. Together, as they stood there, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, the future remained unwritten. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they faced it not with fear, but with hope.